Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody across the country to the Job Shop Quoting, How to Streamline Your Quoting Process. My name is Don Patel, and I'm the Growth Services Manager here at the Georgia MEP. And this is the second in a series of 4 webinars dealing with specifics for the machine shop and the job shop of some findings and areas of interest that we've uncovered during a grant that we've received, basically to look at 100 machine shops across the state of Georgia and to come up with some best practices, and which basically resulted in these 4 webinars. So we'd like to thank everybody for coming. And before I forget, we will be, like the last webinar and the ones coming up, we'll be sending out the presentation to all the attendees along with any of the tools that we discuss. So again, we look forward to everybody on the call. I'm going to mute everybody right now. And Bob, if you could go to the next slide, we'll go ahead and get started. The MEP National Network is a unique public-private partnership that delivers comprehensive and proven solutions to U.S. manufacturers, fueling growth and advancing U.S. manufacturing. We're focused on helping the small and medium-sized manufacturers to generate business results and thrive in today's technology-driven economy. The MEP National Network comprises the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Manufacturing Extension Partnership, and also includes the 51 MEP centers that are located in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and has over 1,300 trusted advisors and experts at more than 400 MEP service locations, providing any U.S. manufacturer with access to resources they need to succeed. Next slide. Last year, the 51 MEP centers worked with approximately 28,000 manufacturers across the nation and created and retained 120,000 jobs and created $16 billion in new sales and saved $1.7 billion in operating expenses, investing $4 billion back into the plants for future growth. Next slide. The Georgia Manufacturing Partnership, Georgia MEP, is the Georgia arm of the national network and is based out of Georgia Tech. We use a solution-based approach to help Georgia manufacturers grow their business by increasing top-line growth and reducing bottom-line cost. As you can see from the map, we have 10 offices across the state, and our team members are strategically located to reach any Georgia manufacturer within 2 hours. Okay, next slide. Like many of the MEP centers across the country, we help manufacturers in their process improvement efforts with technology integration, ISO management systems, product quality, energy savings, sustainability efforts, and identifying and developing new business. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to introduce Bob Wray, who will be our speaker today. Bob is a project manager within the Growth Services Group, and he works out of Georgia Tech's Middle Georgia office, where he specializes in helping Georgia firms develop top-line growth strategies, lean product management, and existing product process improvement. Bob has over 25 years of experience in product design, testing, production implementation, project management, and productivity improvements. Prior to joining Georgia Tech, Bob was chief engineer with Husqvarna, a leading producer of lawn and garden equipment with $2 billion in annual sales. Bob holds a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of South Florida and an MBA from the University of South Carolina. So we're welcome to Bob, and Bob, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate it. Welcome to all of you that have tuned in today. Can you hear me okay, Don? You keep muting me.
You're doing fine.
I just want to make sure before I start talking.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anybody has any issues with hearing or can't hear us, just put a chat note in and we'll address it.
Right. Okay, thanks. As Don mentioned, we've visited and conducted assessments with over 40 machine shops so far, and our goal in doing this is to figure out what they do well, but also identify areas where they can become more efficient. One of the areas that gets a lot of attention in these discussions is this quoting process. Obviously a struggle for a lot of people out there. It's one of the primary factors related to the company's profitability, and I'm not sure I've sat down with anybody yet that's fully comfortable with their quoting process. If anyone is, I'd love to do that and find out what you're doing. In addition to understanding your production costs, there's also strategic factors to consider. In some cases, you might want to quote very aggressively to drive more business, or particularly on underutilized assets, or when you're trying to gain new customers. If you're running near capacity or at capacity on a piece of equipment, you obviously might want to quote higher on that and only take on very profitable jobs. We'll talk about developing a quoting strategy today, as well as getting a better understanding on what it actually costs to produce a particular component in your facility, which I'm guessing is the main struggle from what I've seen. I put this webinar together basically for small to mid-size shops who are quoting manually or are uncomfortable with their software quoting accuracy. It's unlikely large shops, sophisticated quoting software, who fully understand their production costs will benefit a lot from this, but I think there's some of the tools we're going to go through that will help those companies as well make some incremental improvements. Before I start, I wanted to share, y'all answered 5 questions when you signed up for this, and a lot of you signed up late, so this morning I went through those again a little bit, and there's some interesting information there. I was surprised to see 47% of you out there are actually using software packages, and 53% are not, so about 50-50 out there. I'll just talk about a couple of things I'm not really going to address today. One of them that came up a lot was lead times. Finding that your lead times are too long to get specific pieces of business, and I've run into that myself before. Obviously, that's not really part of the quoting process and not something I'm going to talk to today, but I think David Apple did a good job last week on lean tools, which is really your key to driving down your lead times, is to use lean manufacturing processes to do that. And I think your MEP in your state is probably well attuned to that. I know that's one of our leading services here in the state of Georgia, so I just wanted to throw that out there and address it at least. Some people had an issue also with the information they get from the request for quote process, and again, I'm not really going to address that too much today, but I did want to share with you, recently I did a project with a company and we were kind of looking at their time to quote and such, and there was a lot of frustration because they had to keep going back to clients to get information that was not pulled into their RFQs, if you will. The request for quotes, what I'm talking about there, however you nomenclature that and do that. We even found out in their case, it was coming in from 2 different directions in 2 different forms, from inside sales and outside sales. But, in that case, what we really did was talk to the people. We found out what information they were missing, and we let them be part of revising the RFQ form so that they got all the information they need to streamline that process. So I just wanted to throw that out and let you think about that. Hopefully that'd be helpful. A couple of the other things that I saw, one was difficulty getting quotes from outside services to include with your quotes. One suggestion I thought of after we get done going through work today, it'll make a little more sense, but let's say you're using an outside service for powder coating parts. That's kind of a common one I've run into. It's possible you could sit down with your powder coater, develop this similar system I'm going to talk with you about today, and you could actually estimate for them the cost to powder coat parts relatively quickly and streamline that process as well. So just another thing to think about as we go through today. Now, most of the other answers pretty much correlated with things that we've included here and what we've seen in our survey. So I'll move on. First, I wanted to share some of those challenges that have been conveyed to us by the job shops across Georgia. Quoting typically requires a large amount of time, and it must be done by a company's most valuable resources. In most cases, we found that quoting is done by the owner or a veteran employee with extensive experience, and I think the questions that you answered correlated pretty well to that. And this makes sense due to the importance of quote accuracy and the large number of variables that must be considered. One of the interesting question answers was simply tribal knowledge, which I knew what the person meant by that. And hopefully you'll see today how we're going to try to bring that tribal knowledge up into the quoting system, so we're not going out to the factory floor and gaining knowledge for each and every quote we're processing. Even with this focused effort, many companies are still uncomfortable with the accuracy of their quotes. And again, that was reflected in the answers we got from you guys as well. Almost all companies we talked with expressed the desire to have a higher conversion rate. So that one's a little easier, so I was going to address that. I'm sorry, but I got another slide before that. Basically, looking at these challenges, we've tried to capture what an ideal quote process would look like. The objectives basically mirror those challenges we found in the previous slide. In an ideal world, quoting would be quick, efficient, highly accurate, result in a high percentage of orders, provide above average profitability, and could be processed by non-critical personnel. And I know this sounds a bit unrealistic, but hopefully what we provide today will help you begin a journey to get closer to that ideal state. You know, I think of this as similar to the lean principles David went over last month. You know, lean we always think of as a journey, and I think improving your quoting process is a journey as well. I didn't arm myself with silver bullets to shoot out through the internet today and make all of you quoting experts all of a sudden. It's going to be a process to continually scrutinize and incrementally improve over time. Again, talk about the quote conversion rate a little bit first. A little easier to address than the others, and something I think a lot of people could benefit from. Modern Machine Shop put together a survey of top shops. In this survey, they found that best-in-class shops reported an average conversion rate of about 50%. So it might give you a target or something to think about there. We've seen much lower rates. We got about 50% for those who knew, but we found about 40% really just did not know why they were losing quotes. So, you know, we kind of asked why, and price was the most common answer, which I saw in your answers as well. Lead times were often cited, so we saw that as well. Slow quote turnaround times also resulted in business lost. You know, basically not getting the quote in before the bid submission date. In some cases, it was noticed that companies comparison shop to negotiate better prices with their current vendors. So if there was a way to identify those and cull those out, I'll kind of show you something on that later. Most often we found out they were guessing, you know, they just really didn't know why, and we feel this is valuable information you can use to adjust your quoting practice and reduce time spent on quoting and improving your conversion rate. As a side note here, I've thought about this a little bit, and I think a lot of this will lead you to not only ways to improve your quoting process, but also considerations to improve your business practices. They might lead that way too. And again, I'm not addressing that today, but I think that's some of the information we might get out of this as well. You know, how can we be a better vendor to our customers? You know, we suggest what you do is a simple lost order analysis process. Armed with the facts, you can make adjustments to your practices to improve your conversion rate. This will allow you to convert a higher percentage with less effort. In lean terms, it correlates to reducing waste and adding value. So how do we do this? You likely have a process to log your quotes already. Key is to follow up and get the facts. It'll take some time up front, but can pay some dividends long term. Some of you likely have more elaborate programs for lost order analysis, and that's great, but for those of you who don't, I've done this effectively with a simple Excel spreadsheet with some clients. Basically collect the data and graph the results. It's as simple as that. Becomes very clear why quotes are not being converted to business. Key then is to take that information and take action to improve the process. You may want to start no quoting particular clients or types of components you're not competitive on. You may want to prioritize and expedite other clients and types of components you do very well. If you haven't done this, we suggest you at least do it for a month or two, kind of get a data point there, see what you learn, and then see how that can be used to add value to your processes. You may want to continue it as a follow-up as part of your ongoing process, or possibly put it on your calendar to repeat semi-annually or annually. Some shops we've assessed find value in following up on every quote. They either get the business or they understand why it was lost and use that information to make adjustments as they go forward. This is one of the tools we're going to be sending to you. It's very simple. It's an Excel sheet with 2 tabs. First tab is basically just log your quotes in, and I put columns in here. This is fictitious information, obviously I made up. The date, quote number, who the client is, and then however you identify parts in your system or their part numbers. Basically, I put a 1 in if you lost the business and a 0 if you won the business. And that simply just adds all the ones up so you know how many you lost. The total number is added up here. And then it just adds these, just put a 1 for whatever the reason was, then you can see what your percentages are. If you just use this, wipe my data out and start putting your data in here and just add rows in here, and that'll keep the formulas adding up all of the order results you have. And I always like to look at a graph, so I've got this information thrown over on a graph. Again, fictitious information. This has no correlation to why you might or might not be converting your quotes to business. So again, it's just a tool, a starting point for those who don't have anything. So let's talk through the actual quoting process itself. The basics are pretty straightforward. Starts with estimating the cost to produce the components, including the cost of material, labor, and overhead. Add a reasonable amount of profit and you're done. As we know, it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of underlying costs in each of these areas that are difficult to identify. I've done quite a bit of cost estimating myself, and I've always done well on the aspects that were clearly identified. Where I always fell short were things that were overlooked or left out, not fully understood, if you will. These minor details add up to erode profitability over time. The tendency is to cover these cost-eroding details by applying higher margins or standard cost adders. I know a lot of companies they throw maybe a 35% profit on top of orders just to cover the unknowns, if you will. And while this might be okay in some cases, it's typically not applicable to all quotes. Tendencies make sure you overquote so you don't lose money, and you could be losing profitable business as a result. The key is to feel comfortable you have a good cost estimation, and then have a set of application rules for adding profit. And I'll go through later what I kind of mean by this application rules thing instead of having a fixed profit margin. These application rules, in a lot of cases, mimic what your knowledgeable quoting experts or owners are doing when they put out their quotes. So I wanted to explore, I wanted to explore each area and try to expose some of these unknowns, if you will, and then talk about a method to capture these variables in your cost estimates. As we go through these, keep in mind these are general examples to provoke thought. Each of your business will have its own set of considerations to identify and account for. The raw material cost for the part itself is easy to identify. But if it's not material you normally stock, what do you do with the excess then? How do you account for that? Does it have any value to your company? What about vendor cost variance from the time you quote to the time you actually run the job? How do you handle those? Scrap, material handling, things of that nature. Who places orders, pays invoices? How do we account for their time? Who meets the delivery truck, unloads it, stores the material? How is material transferred to the point of use when it's needed? How do we account for that time? As you see, there's a lot of indirect costs just floating around the material itself. Labor is not that different. Additional, you can usually identify the actual time to produce parts, although it might be difficult. You can get a handle on that. There's additional labor considerations surrounding that are typically missed. You know, if there's multiple operations, you have to move material from one machine to the other and account for that. Job preparation times, setup times, deconstruction time to pull the setup down when the job's complete. Operators sometimes need to fill out paperwork, make computer entries. Quality checks have to be performed sometimes, so you need to account for those. How are you going to package the parts and ship them? Some people notify customers that a shipment's ready to go. You know, who handles that, and how do we account for all of that time? Invoice collection activities. These are just some of the hidden labor costs that must be covered by your quotes. You know, overhead allocation is a major dilemma. It's a tough subject. Some companies use a holistic approach, and they allocate total overhead based on direct labor. Probably the most simplest way to do it, and if you're not doing it, I'll kind of show you how to start there at least. Some divide up the facility by area and allocate based on overhead cost in each area. If you had say, machine shop and some different areas, machine shop, a metal fabrication shop, a welding area, you might want to do one from each area and apply them separately. In addition to that, you hear them refer to variable and fixed overheads. Variable overhead is said to vary by the production quantities or the number of employees in some cases. Maintenance costs for a machine would vary depending on how much that machine was used, number of hits or number of hours of runtime. Health insurance for employees obviously is variable by how many employees you have in the facility. Fixed costs are those costs that are independent from production volumes. It includes things like rents, mortgage, loan payments, possibly the sales and management staff and their expenses. So a good question I always ask people when we get into this is utility bills fixed or variable? It's not really a right or wrong answer here, but you've got to handle it somehow. Some people do it in both ways. They do a category for fixed and then variable based on production. And you know, most people just, I tend to include it just as a fixed cost, just so you know. Anyone who's done this knows that allocating overhead is not a straightforward. You know, my method for small shops in particular is to assume we're going to operate with a certain number of employees and a total annual sales expectation. And I know it's a guess and it won't be right, but you've got to start somewhere. I treat all costs at fixed at this level of operation, and then I apply it to each part quote as a percentage of annual sales. Using these assumptions simplifies things and allows you to account for overhead in a systematic fashion. You know, part of this process is to review these costs periodically and make adjustments over time. If you get started on it, you'll get better at it. You know, think of this whole quoting process as a living document with costs and allocations changing over time. It will need to be revisited periodically to keep it in tune with the business. Only introduce complexity as it creates value. You know, I talked about dividing into different areas. See if this has value for you or not. If not, don't do it. It's more work. More complex the system is, the more it's going to cost you to develop and maintain it. Again, always focus on creating value when you're going through these. Let's talk a little bit about profit. Assuming you develop a system to accurately estimate your costs, the other part of your quote is the profit you apply. The balance between making more money and being competitive to drive more business. On top of that, all business is not created equal. So one way to handle this is to apply a sliding profit margin scale. typically based on the component, the volume, and the customer. Thinking here is that current customers require less transactional costs, as do higher volume components. A one-time order from a new customer might be the high end of your profit margin scale, while recurring high volume orders from a current customer might be the low end of the scale. Other variables to consider are lead time and how the components integrate with your current production levels, taking into account the equipment and processes that are either over or underutilized. Again, your processes assumptions need to be clearly documented, reviewed periodically, and modified accordingly. Before we walk through the cost estimation process, I wanted to introduce a concept of activities-based costing, or you'll see it referred to as ABC costing sometimes. I think everything has to have a three-letter nomenclature to go by. So ABC costing or activity-based costing. It's actually an accounting method. It identifies and assigns costs and overhead activities, and then assigns these costs to products. It's less arbitrary than traditional accounting methods, and it's found a niche in the manufacturing sector. Now, I'm not suggesting we become cost accountants, but the concepts are useful to understand for building a good cost estimating process. I don't have time today to go into the ABC costing and all the ins and outs, but I wanted to share it with you so you could do some research on your own. Just Google activities-based costing, get a general understanding of it. Investopedia had some good information, so I put that link here. And again, we'll be sending this out to you, so you can just copy that link. That link will probably come up pretty high in the search if you just type in activities-based costing. Another important concept is process mapping. Hopefully most of you are familiar with that. You know, it's basically just a list of series of activities in sequential fashion to get really any job done. Value stream mapping is a lean tool you might be familiar with, or you might have used spaghetti diagrams to track movements in your facilities. These are all also concepts which will be helpful in building a costing system. You can research these if you're not familiar with them, or your state's MEP probably has some good information on these tools. Basically, what we want to do is list all of the activities that take place from when you take an order to when you collect final payment, a process map, if you will, including producing and shipping the components, and then we want to assign a cost to each of that activity. The main difference from a normal process map is we're building a system for variable components, multiple levels of complexity. So we need to identify and include variables where applicable. And I'll show you what I mean by that, and we'll make a little more sense here in a few slides. Simple example would be setup times on a piece of equipment, which would vary by the complexity of the component. If quality checks are required, again, the complexity of the part and customer requirements will drive the time you spend and your cost associated with that activity. Without getting into too much detail, I thought I'd walk through the steps I use to develop a cost estimation tool. And I've done this with a number of clients now, and it's worked pretty well. It always takes a side road here or there, but it's a good starting point. The first thing I always make them do is pick something fairly simple. They always want to start with their biggest problem they're facing now, but you know, learning a new tool is better if it's not as complex, obviously. So start simple and then build on your success once you get a handle on it. So the first thing we do is to map the process from order entry to receipt of payment. I do this with sticky notes on the wall. It's not a difficult process. You just need a group of knowledgeable folks. Once you get a consensus on that process map, then just simply list all of those activities in sequence. I'd use Excel to do this. Identify each activity as variable or fixed. Now, by fixed cost here, it has no implication on your overhead cost. I just mean you can identify it as a fixed cost, or typically a unit of time. If you say pull material and bring it to the job, it takes an average of 15 minutes. It's not worth making that variable, so we just put 15 minutes in for every job. That's an example. So you estimate the cost or the time actually for fixed activities. Determine the input parameters for the variable activities, and that's usually the most difficult thing to do, but it can be done. Setup time's a good example. Equipment run times, things like that. Come up with rules and variables that allow you to estimate those accordingly. You may want to use more fixed costs to begin with, and then add variables as a continual improvement effort. Perform time studies to validate your estimates and improve accuracy. If you're creating a custom quoting tool, use this information to create it in a similar sequential fashion. That makes future modifications more straightforward if you can correlate your activities list directly to your quoting sheet when you make changes that'll keep the two tied together. Again, variables will likely be put in time units, and then you convert those to cost using standard labor rates. And those can be updated periodically as well. Make sure, again, you document what you do and why. I know when I go back and look at what I did, sometimes I can't have a clue why I did it unless I've got some documentation there. Again, keep these lists in sync for future modifications, so that'll be much more straightforward for you. I'm going to send out this example. It's got some sample data in it, and I'll kind of go through this, and then you can look at it yourself if you want to develop your own tool inside. We'll talk about software kind of at the end. I'll address that a little bit. This is what a process map looks like. Again, I put them on 2 lines here so you can see it all on one slide. But basically it reads left to right, and I always do this in a sequential fashion, but you can see order entry, get the material ordered, schedule the job, you just walk right through. By the way, this example is for a flat laser part. I picked something I'm relatively familiar with and was fairly simple and straightforward for these examples and to start with. You know, run the job, deburr, you know, all the way to invoice and collections. So we've got a list of all of the activities it takes to do this simple flat laser cut part, no forming. So again, pretty simple. I just take that. There was 12 of those. I put them in a list over here. I number them. I like to identify who is responsible for those particular jobs or areas and let them participate and come up with these times and the estimates and the variables. It does 2 things: get your people on board, lets them be part of the process, and it also doesn't saddle one person trying to do all of the work. As you can see, I've identified whether they're variable or not. The ones that I'm assuming are not variable, we put in our time estimates here, and you might want to go out and do some work validating those. I've just filled this in to get something started here. This first one here that's variable, Sally is our programmer for the lasers. So we got a program, put a program in for each laser, nest the parts, all that good stuff. If it's a current part and we're sharpening our pencil on this quote, there's a 0 there. It's already programmed. She doesn't need to do anything. I put in 10 minutes if the client supplies data, a DXF form or whatever you use to program your lasers or your machines. And then if no data is supplied and she has to create it, I put 60 minutes in for that. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong on these numbers, guys. I just filled it in so we had some data and you can see how the process works. You can see at the beginning here for 7, 8, 9, I think, and 11, they're variable, but we just don't know enough. The part runtime, we need to get some more information and think this one through. So, you know, I put a note out here. We need to do a time study and develop guidelines based on the parts and the complexity. Again, deburr and removal. Might be able to combine that with above, not sure, but again, that needs some more study. So what you do is allow these people some time to go back, get this information, come back, get everything filled in. So predetermined overhead rate, we talked about that, and this is kind of the simplest form of it, and you can research and do all sorts of things with overhead. But for our purposes, what we're going to do is accumulate all costs that are not directly included in cost estimates. All of those costs that we can't directly assign to the parts we're making. The rate is going to equal your annual overhead costs, the sum of all those costs, and divide it by your expected annual direct labor costs. So you've got a percentage of overhead direct you can apply to direct labor. So we want to multiply this rate by your labor dollars in your quote. You'll see I've got an example of that later, if that's not clear. I talked about profit guidelines, and I've also included at the bottom, it'll probably be on a separate sheet just for the slide I did that, a no quote list and why. Profit guidelines, and again, I made up these numbers. I'm not suggesting you go out and use these as your profit guidelines. As you can see, I've got 6 categories from current customers with high volume parts at the lowest profit margin to one-time low volume customers, and that might even need to be 50%. You know, these are numbers you're going to have to take a look at and come up with. Now, this is obviously work for the owner or CEO. This is a business decision of how you do this. But this can let you be more competitive on those high volume, those bread and butter products, if you will. And then if you're going to take on, say, prototype work or things like that, you know you're going to want high margins on those because there's still going to be a tremendous amount of hidden costs and transactional cost in those. No quote list, I just threw some things up here. You know, this company always price shops, so we're not going to waste our time on them. This particular XYZ company, we know they're financially unsound. They have payment problems. You know, I like to get paid for the work I do, so we're just going to no quote those guys. Don't worry about the bottom line. You know, I probably should have included on list, there might be particular types of components you want to no quote. Just don't waste your time on them. They're not things you're good at. You don't get that type of business. Focus in those areas where you can drive business and profitable business. So this hopefully would give your quoting folks, which might not be your top executives anymore, guidelines of what to quote, what not to quote, and you know how to quote is what it's all about. I threw this example together of what a quote sheet might look like. Now in the example you're going to get, this information over on the right will be at the bottom, and you can see I've copied the total time over here, but I wanted to fit it on a slide so you could actually read it. And again, this is just flat laser part. This is my example I put together. I'm not suggesting you pay your people $35 an hour. I just threw a number in there. Direct labor, dollars per hour. And this is the overhead rate we've established. Now, these two are in blue because you don't want to update them or put them in every time you do a quote. But periodically over time, you know, your labor rates are going to go up periodically over time, whether you like it or not. Hopefully, you can drive your overhead rate down with some work. But anyway, that's why those are blue. Each of these yellow cells would be cells that you would input as the cost estimator or the quoting supplier. And you can see these little red ticks here. If you hover over them, I've got a little explanation here on each one of them. A comment is what it's called in Excel. This is the profit percentage we've pulled off of our guidelines. These are just input. These are those fixed times that I talked about. And you can see I've combined some of them, but I've kept them in the order that the process flows still, rather than combining them all and having to go back and try to figure that out. Programming the laser, remember that was 10, 30, or 60, I think. And if you're sharp with Excel, you can do pull downs on these as well. I've done that sometimes. And again, we've got to come up with something to estimate our part run times, quality checks, and the packaging and shipping might vary as well. So these would be the variables that your quoting person would put into this format. Get your total time, applies your direct labor, applies your overhead coming out of these numbers. Material, hopefully you've got a way already to estimate your material cost and some guidelines. If not, that would come off of a separate sheet or a tab on this tool. However you do that with material. I've assumed most people can identify material and have some guidelines for that. Get you a total cost, applies profit again with your profit margin. This is the quote for the entire job. included the number of parts. I know when I get a quote, I like to get a full quote and the piece price stated on that quote, but obviously that's up to you. You can add and delete lines and do with this what you will. So hopefully that kind of sums up from beginning to end the process I use to identify. And I know it's not easy. There'll be a ton of work to do in here, particularly as it gets more complex. But having a good handle and knowing what your costs are, and then some rules to apply profit will hopefully help you drive more business. Before I talk about software, I wanted to throw out, there was one company that I did quite a bit of this work with that was fairly complex, and the owner, quite frankly, was just quoting off the cuff. And his question to me, can we figure out what this stuff costs for me to build so I can know what I'm quoting and whether I'm making money or losing money? So we went through this process and did this. And the interesting part of the story was later, we talked a few times afterwards and made a few corrections and updates as he used the tool. But basically the wrap-up discussion at the end of that, his take on it was that he was quoting less jobs because he knew who was just out there price shopping, and he wasn't going to get that business anyway, at least not profitably. So he was doing less work, and he was actually getting a little less percentage of the quotes he was putting out there, which is not what I'm suggesting or hoping for you. But in his case, I think there was a lot of people, his competitors in industry, that didn't know their costs either. And he said, part of his follow-up process, he found out that people were making these parts for less than he could even make them for, much less have any profit in it. And he was pretty efficient. He was not highly inefficient at all. But we attributed that to the fact that people were out there basically losing money on jobs. And this was a pretty competitive environment at the time. I don't think the environment's quite as bad right now, but it will be again. Anyway, as a wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about software programs. It looks like about half of you have them out there. I still suggest going through this mapping process and understanding your costs well. With anything, garbage in's garbage out. And if you don't have good information to input into that software program, you're probably not comfortable with the results you're getting out of that, or you don't feel comfortable with those at least. Good input is vital to creating an accurate and reliable quoting program, whether you create that tool yourself or you use a commercial software program. Also, understanding your processes and variables will help you shop for a program if you don't have one. You want one that does what you need as simply as possible. Over complexity will just cause you more work and you won't get value out of it. So that should help you shop for what you need once you understand this costing and your processes. Pricing models vary out there too. You can pay for the program up front, and then it typically comes with fixed annual fees. I don't know all of them, but I've seen quite a few of those. Some vendors even have little or no upfront cost and charge you based on a percentage of each order you attained. Becoming partners with you basically is what they're doing. Programs can be resident on your servers or they can be out in the cloud. And I don't know what the right decision is for you, but take a look at that and the implications for your business. Shop well before you make a purchase and consider the overall value. Remember, complexity is going to cost you money, so keep it as simple as possible. If you need help with anything we've covered today, I know I've gone through this fairly quickly. It's a pretty complex topic, but hopefully we've thrown some things out there that can help you improve what you're doing. Contact your local MEP. I think they probably have facilitation experts that can help you through this. I know we do here in Georgia. So that's it. Thanks for being with us today. Again, it's pretty complex. I tried to keep it simple, and hopefully you can use these to improve your quoting process.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate that. Great job. We've got a few minutes, about 15 minutes left, so plenty of time. I'm going to unmute everybody for questions, and we'll see how that works. Or you can put it in the chat box and ask the question that way. So I'll go ahead and unmute everybody. And if you have a question, you should be unmuted. Okay, it looks like, unfortunately, we do have a little bit of a glitch here. It looks like I can't unmute everybody. I have to do it individually, but there's too many in the session. So if you wouldn't mind asking a question through the question app or doing a chat. I do have one question. What is the best way to follow up with a customer?
Best way to follow up with a customer?
Yes.
Typically it's just a phone call and follow up with them, make sure they, typically it's best to create a dialogue. I know a number of companies that do this and they have a dialogue for following up with customers. So all of their people can do it and follow the dialogue, but basically make sure they got the quote and, and everything's okay with it. And then, basically just ask them, are you planning to place the business with us or not? But again, come up with that dialogue that your company's comfortable with. It's an extension of your business, if you will. At the end of that, you obviously want to say, if they place the business elsewhere, what were the reasons for not placing it with us? And they'll typically share that with you. I don't think many people run across businesses that don't want to share that information. They'll typically tell you why. You don't need to know how much somebody underquoted you or what their lead times were unless they want to share that information. That's how I've seen people do it effectively. It's just part of their process. Every quote gets followed up on. In fact, one of the guys that he's my mentor in the sales and marketing arena of running a business. He follows up on every quote, has a dialogue for it. It is a substantial part of his business.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Okay, I see another one coming in.
It's probably 1,000 questions. Not sure how to answer.
No, that was actually just was a thank you from Ryan.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, either your presentation was very clear or very unclear, but I'm going to go with the very clear part.
Everyone's lost, right?
Yeah.
So follow up with us if you want to do any of this, and we can talk through it more. I know there's over 100 of you out there, so hopefully everybody doesn't call this afternoon. But I'll get back with you as soon as possibly can and talk through whatever you need.
Okay. All right. Well, if you go to the next slide, Bob, we'll wrap it up.
I'm trying there.
Again, I'd like to thank everybody. This was the second in the series of 4 on machine shops, and we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Again, we're going to be sending out today's slides in a follow-up email along with copies of those 2 worksheets that Bob had talked about and showed you, the lost order and the quoting one. And hopefully that'll give you some information you can get started, and that'll be useful for you. We still have plenty of seats available in the remaining 2 webinars on your screen. Machine shop sales and growth strategies. Again, looking at more on the top line side of things, and this one about ways we can grow the business. And then the last one is how to take a proactive approach to marketing your machine shop. So we're going to delve into marketing and the web and some of those issues in the last webinar. So you can register online for those at that link provided, and we look forward to you guys signing up for the remaining 2. And appreciate your attendance. And let me check one more time. I'm just looking for any more questions. And if there's anybody that is not had within Georgia that has not had assessments, also email us and Bob, and we'll be glad to come out and do a machine shop assessment. Not everybody on the call probably has had one, but that is a no-charge service that we're doing under this grant. So I wanted to mention that. And I don't see any other questions. So we will bid you goodbye from hot Atlanta, and look forward to seeing you guys on August 6th for the Sales and Growth Strategies one done by our excellent presenter, Andy Helm, another one of our growth service staff members. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.